Alrighty, everyone's popping in here. Happy Tuesday. All right, we got some handle forms and extruder demo planned for today. There we go. Alrighty. So the last couple weeks, you've seen some trimming and some carving and some throwing of all sorts of summer bowls and cups, and I thought I'd finish it off with just an overview and some tips and tricks on all of our extruder tools. So we have a lot. I just have a few of them here, a lot of different shapes and sizes, and there's a few little tips and some tricks and some things that I've found and I've heard from others in using all of these. So I'm going to use some of my favorites and some of the popular ones, and then I'm also going to be using our handle forms, which you can check out. We have 10 different shapes. I'll pop this one off. So we have various handle form shapes. You can check them out. They're plastic. They're really simple. You just use them to set up your handle, and it'll sort of firm up, dry, shape it if you want to make a bunch of the same shape. I'm going to be using 5 today, and I'll show you how I use them, and then we do have 5 other shapes, so check those out. I've already pulled a couple and I've let these sit, so I'll get to these in a minute. I just wanted them to firm up a little bit. But first things first, we'll grab our bag of clay. Now on the extruders, you can go right from a fresh bag of clay. That's what I'll be using today. You can also cut a slab and sort of lay it out, 15, 20 minutes, let it firm up. You may find it a little bit easier to pull the extrusion out of there, but I'll show you on a fresh bag of clay how you can get a really clean extrusion and a really clean shape out of there. I know that some folks, when they're using them, you might have trouble. It'll like re-stick, especially on a fresh bag of wet clay. So this is pretty soft. You wouldn't even really want to use this to pull a handle. It's very soft, very sticky. So, but it's okay, because if you use these the right way, it's not a problem. So the biggest tip that I give people is when you're using the R tool, the extruder tool, it's important to pull at a low angle. And so a lot of folks I'll see come in kind of high up, and they'll try to pull it through, and that it just kind of like will dig upwards. It'll want to cut upwards, and you don't really get like a clean cut. The clay also tends to really want to stick back to itself, especially at this dryness. So if you're pulling through at a high angle, you might struggle trying to like peel this out. And when that happens, the surface of the extrusion usually doesn't turn out because it's kind of re-sticking and you're just pulling it apart. So the real trick to this is to pull at a low angle. And even on a piece of like a fresh bag of clay, it's no problem. So as I'm pulling, I'm not pushing down at all. I'm just purely pulling backwards. You'll see that this clay will actually start to lift up. So that little extrusion is going to lift itself out, and that's what you want to see. And it will practically pull itself out on the tool if you're at that proper angle. So that's something that you can use to look for. You're also going to get a much cleaner finish. There's a couple little spots where I'd stop there, but you're going to get a much cleaner finish if you're pulling at a low angle. It ends up, you sort of compress the clay on the inside of that blade, and that's what lifts it up out of there. So again, even on a pretty wet piece of clay, fresh bag, you'll get a clean extrusion. The biggest thing is pulling at that low angle. The other thing I'll say is on some of the smaller tools, for example, and all of them. So we have the depth ski, and so this is the little piece of metal that you can adjust to change the thickness of the extrusion that you pull out. You can loosen the little thumb screw, basically move that little ski up and down. So if you move it down, your shape's gonna get thinner, so you're actually just cutting right there. If you push it up, you're gonna get a much thicker extrusion. And so usually we set them kind of right in the middle. A lot of the time I'll adjust mine even a little bit thinner, especially on like the large tools. If you really want a big meaty handle, you can set it all the way up and you'll get one. But when you're pulling through, that depth ski is really just meant to sort of glide along the surface. And so it doesn't need a lot of pressure downwards. So rather than pushing down, I've seen people do this, you get a really deep groove, you end up kind of smushing this back in the clay and it's hard to get out. So again, if you're having this problem, watch carefully. And I'm showing it again just because I know this is the number one concern with them. But I'm gonna use the same tool, pull at a low angle. I'm not gonna push into the clay, I'm just gonna let it glide right along the surface. You'll see it'll come up all by itself. You end up with little to no indent on the back and you end up with a really clean shape that comes out of it. All right, so that's the actual pulling motion. We'll cut this off. All right, so once you have your extrusion, there's a few things you can do. That you can go right onto your piece. That's totally fine. Typically, what I recommend is letting it sit up for a little bit, and it kind of depends how soft your bag of clay is. Or you can use one of our handle forms. And so the way these work is you can just drape that shape right over the top, and you're gonna end up with that shape of handle. So this is the number 6. They all have a little number on the back side if you want to keep track of that. And then you can let this firm up for a little bit. And so these here have been doing that. This one is number 8. So it's much smaller. You're gonna end up with this tight little corner here and then kind of like a flat swooping shape going on a cup. That's what you'd look like. This piece dried out a little bit, so I'm just using it as an example. So we try to kind of cover all the shapes and sizes. I'll pull all of these off. All of the stands, they will click together like this. So if you want to get a bunch of the same shape, you can make a whole row of them, line them up. That way, that's typically what I do if I do use handles or put handles on, I'll make 5 or 6 of the same shape. That way when I go to attach them, they're ready to go. So the number 10 is a very tight little U. And remember, these shapes are kind of like the inside of the handle. So they might seem a little bit small, but remember your handle's actually gonna go around the outside and it's gonna be a little bit bigger. So keep that in mind. I have all these stuck together. So there's just little hooks on the bottom. All the little stands pull apart. And when you get them, they come with a stand and the handle form itself. Just click these together, just like that. And then they have the little hooks here. Put them together. So one interesting one that I wanted to show is the number 9. It's got this really wild squiggly shape in it. This one has a couple uses. I'll move all these. So, for example, now this is one that I pulled a little bit ago. I let firm up a little bit. So it's not quite leather hard, but it's not quite like a fresh piece. So I'm not gonna mess it up just by touching it. I'll put this on here. So this one is really made, you can get this nice swooping arch, bend that over. And then there's 2 things you can do on the back end here. You can just leave the handle like that and you kind of end up with like a mini kind of standard ear shape handle. Or we added this little swoop, so if you like doing any kind of little curl or sort of flare right at the end, it'll always do that in the same spot. So you can end up with a little kind of ear shape with a little flare, and then you can do whatever you want on the bottom here. So that's the purpose of the number 9, if you happen to see that. These two, so the 8, and I'll pull this off, and the 6. So these two are kind of the more angular, triangular shapes. You'll notice on the front side, so where the stand is, and this one's a little bit more extreme, is that angle actually cuts kind of under. So if you find yourself putting a handle on there, a lot of the time as this dries, it's going to want to kind of open up, it's going to shrink, so these sides are going to open as it dries. So that's why that angle, it's actually like an undercut. So if you want to stick it to that form, as it dries, by the time you go to take off, that's going to end up being a lot closer to 90 degrees. So keep that in mind. And then same with this larger one. We'll put it on there. It's got a little bit of an undercut. So you'll, it's going to be a smaller than 90-degree angle. By the time it dries and kind of comes off when you're using it, it's going to be a lot closer to 90 degrees. So the next little tip I'm going to show is, and I really like this one. Once I heard about it, we didn't come up with it. I've just talked to a number of folks who use these, and it's what they do, is I'll pull sort of a short segment like this right off the bag of clay, and then I will go in and I'll actually pull it just a little bit like you would a handle. Not much. It just tends to sort of stretch it out a little bit, and it adds a little bit of like kind of natural handle shape to it, I guess. And even on something like this 203 where you have a lot of intricate designs and little grooves and stuff, it'll keep all of that as long as I'm not pulling, you know, too much. But you kind of end up with a tapered shape. The side of it looks a lot, you know, smoother, natural, but you still keep all of that really interesting glaze groove. Really cool shape. So you could keep going with this however you want. And I kind of recommend doing this with the extra large shapes, just because the small ones, you have to keep in mind, they're going to shrink. And so if you start with a small handle, you pull up more. You can if you want, but just keep in mind you're going to end up with a really small handle at the end. The extra large actually seem to be a really nice shape for this. And so you start out with a little bit bigger kind of on the top, and then that's going to taper down. And then I'll put this on here, how I might like it. And then let it firm up just like that. The other nice thing about using the form is that if you wanted to add in any other kind of details, so stamps or clean it up, it's just a nice surface to work on. So if you had something like a plain handle, like this, put that on, we'll smooth that out. So let's say you started with a plain handle and then you wanted to add some grooves to it. So it acts as like a surface that you can actually carve on. Sometimes it's hard to do this just holding the handle, so you can actually so just for example, you can use it as a little bit of a work surface if you want to add details or other little features. Alrighty. So the last thing I'll show you on these is kind of how they turn out. So in our showroom, if you happen to come by, we have a bunch of these glazed little handle rings. And so these two in particular are the R4 and the R204. And so the R4 is this concave shape, the 204 is the extra large version. But this is how they end up, you know, once they're glazed and fired. So keep in mind they are gonna shrink, and it's really neat to see just where the glaze goes, and especially in some of the others where you have a lot of deep grooves, it will pool in there. The R4, a lot of the time folks like it, but remember it's gonna shrink, so it ends up being, you know, on the smaller side of the handle. That kind of will show you the shape versus what it shrinks to. And then the 204, which is a pretty nice size, so that's the same shape, and that's kind of what it will shrink to. So keep that in mind. If you want to do that pull thing and kind of taper it out, you know, start with an extra large. It'll be plenty big, and then as you pull it, it'll taper out. Some other neat ones are the 203. So this one here was the 203 that I pulled. It's got a lot of really cool grooves in there, and this is how it turns out with the glaze in there. This one's a lot of fun. It still has a nice sort of thumb groove on top, but you get these two really thin bands of glaze on the side and then one big pool in the middle. So depending on what you're doing, you're gonna get a lot of movement on this. So that's a fun one. That's the 203. And then another couple favorites are the 209. So this is the large double round. You get just a single nice groove going down the middle for glaze to go on. And then this is the R16. So this one is, when you pull it, it might be a little deceiving, I've noticed. So this is the R16 on its own. It's a double concave, we call it. So you have two sort of wider dips in there. The tool, where did I go with it? Oh yeah, the tool looks like this. So that's the shape that you get. But then when it's fired and glazed, what really stands out are these two sort of wide grooves where glaze is gonna pool. So sometimes it's you got to think about, you know, how that shape is going to translate to what the glaze is going to do and how it's going to feel. But the R16 is nice because you just get these really large bands of glaze. One last little thing is some of the old tools. So if some of you out there have an older R tool that is pre-thumb screw, so the way that you can adjust it, I'm using our multi-tool. You just loosen that little screw and you can adjust that depth ski just the same. So a lot of the time, you know, you kind of set it the way you like and there's not a whole lot of reason to change it. But on all the new extruding tools, there's a little thumb screw that you can do it. If you want to switch over your tools to the thumb screw, we do sell just the little hardware that you can do that. So it's a little bit easier. You can do it kind of on the fly. But again, a lot of these, once you sort of adjust them the way you like, you can set it and forget it. Alrighty, so I think that's it for today. If you got any other questions on these, or if you want to see some other shapes, comment, tag us on other cool ideas that you work on, and thanks for joining. Quick note on next week is actually going to be the start of Clay Share month. So check out Clay Share. Jessica's going to be doing a lot of demos, and I'll be on there the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th week of August. And we'll be doing a similar sort of throwing, trimming, carving, all sorts of fun stuff. Clay Share is great. Jessica does a great job. So tune into that. And you'll see us on there, and then maybe a few short little demos on our regular time during the week. So anyway, thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.